Well, my name's Jim Bonham, and I've got two main roles really. One of them is working on behalf of Public Health England, and that's as laboratory lead for the blood spot screening program, newborn screening program, and the other one is a professional role as president of the International Society for Neonatal Screening, and that's an organisation that has around 500 members in 50 countries throughout the world. So for the Public Health England bit, then I advise, and it is an advisory role, so it's not a direct management role, but I advise on both the operation and the development of newborn screening within the United Kingdom. We've got a small team at the Blood Spot Programme Centre managed by a lady called Christine Kavanagh, and she's got two or three advisors, of which I'm one, and so I spend a couple of days a week doing that. In terms of the role for ISNS, the International Society of Neonatal Screening, then that's very much about helping to develop newborn screening, including in the UK, but not just in the UK, right across the world, and inputting into the existing programs, improving and refining those, but also developing new programs where existing programs don't already exist. Well, it began along with many places in Europe in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So we've been going for just over 50 years now. And we began famously with screening really on the inspiration of Robert Guthrie, who designed not just a test for one condition, phenylketonuria, but also famously a card, a mechanism of getting a blood sample impregnated onto filter paper and sent conveniently in the post. And that card is often associated with his name. In fact, people often call it the Guthrie card, more commonly perhaps described nowadays as the dried blood spot screening card. But for many years, it bore his name. And so screening began back 50 years ago with that single condition, phenylketonuria, and of course has been added to progressively. And the next big step came to add in screening for congenital hypothyroidism, and then a bit beyond that, screening for things like sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, and then a much wider range of inherited metabolic disorders. And that's really linked. The need to do that came from advances in treatment when it became quite obvious that if you detect these babies early, it can make a huge impact upon their lives and treat them early. And of course, it's also been linked a bit to screening technology. So we not only have to have a reason to do screening, but of course we have to have a means to be able to deliver that safely and effectively. So things like this sophisticated technique called tandem mass spectrometry, which allowed us to detect a whole range of individual conditions, allowed us to make a big step forward in identifying a number of conditions simultaneously. And of course, now we're stepping off into the genomics era, then that's going to open more doors for us as we begin to apply in a very targeted and specific way genetic testing, at least as a possibility for some conditions. Hugely. I think we're all aware these days, and have been for many years, that we really need the direct input and help of patients and families with these conditions to be able to design the screening programs well. And so generally speaking, on most of our advisory boards within Public Health England, we'll have a patient family voice on that. And very often they bring a kind of real world dimension to some of the more theoretical things that we're talking about, and very often make us think again about some of the ways in which we can organize screening more effectively. But of course, in addition to that, the family voice, the patient voice is often advocating strongly for the inclusion of new and potentially treatable disorders, and working with politicians and others to help bring resources and to help raise that up the agenda, if you like, of public and governmental thinking. So that's a really good thing for us. And sometimes organisations like Metabolic Support UK are directly involved in helping to start and to run projects. More recently, we've got some direct funding to produce an app for families with inherited metabolic disease that we want to use on the back of a new screening diagnosis. So there are those roles of advocacy, those roles of advice and involvement, and occasionally in a small innovative way, some direct role for funding to improve services. Well, I think very often I've been along to some of the annual meetings, and they're a superb place of interchange as we can share ideas and plans, get a bit of feedback from patients and families about the new things on the horizon and about some fresh information about old conditions. And that's always interesting for us, and I hope as well interesting for the families. But the patients and families often also play an active role. For instance, when we began to develop expanded newborn screening for additional IMD conditions in the UK, families volunteered to have their story told and recorded by video. And that was probably one of the single things that got us the most positive feedback during the rollout of that expanded screening program, was the feedback that we got from other families saying just what a treasure that was, that these families were bold enough and brave enough and encouraging enough to share their story, and many families found that a huge support. So we used that material, and that's very precious for us. And as we've said as well, we know that Metabolic Support UK and indeed other organisations will often work alongside politicians, particularly, and been to several events that have been hosted at the House of Commons, where the profile of not just metabolic disease, but screening for metabolic disease has been emphasised by the hard work of Metabolic Support UK. Well, I've already mentioned we're stepping right into this genomics era now. I think we've got to be very careful and circumspect about how we use genetic testing, because of course it can potentially reveal important family information, but nevertheless, used properly, it can be a powerful tool, not only to diagnose new conditions that we currently can't include within newborn screening because there aren't suitable biochemical markers, but also to refine testing for existing conditions so that we understand in a much more detailed way the best way to treat those patients. I guess that that one of the things that we're planning in the immediate short term is the beginning of screening for severe combined immune deficiency, at least as an evaluation. And we're going to do that in 6 centres in the UK, starting hopefully in September of this year. We'll do that evaluation for 2 years. And then if that looks as if it's promising and looks as if it yields the results that we hope it will, then hopefully that may become part of a national program. One thing that we're particularly keen on at the minute in screening in the UK, but not just the UK, is finding out what happens to patients after they've had their newborn screening result and have gone on to treatment. And so we're beginning to look at outcomes, particularly for the newly introduced inherited metabolic disorders that have been included within the screening program, to find out what happens to those children at, let's say, 4 and 5 years of age. And the reason that we're doing that is partly to demonstrate that actually screening works, that in fact it's good and effective for these children, but also to improve screening and indeed to improve treatment so that we can get even better results. So this emphasis, not just on screening, but actually on looking at outcomes, is a big push that we're having, certainly within ISNS right across the world. And I know a lot of countries, including the UK, are quite keen in following up on that. The other thing that, of course, we want to do, we've said that in the UK, we've had the benefit of newborn screening for at least one inherited metabolic disorder for the last 50 years. But of course, that's not true right across the world. And so actually earlier in this year, we had the first meeting of an international global task force jointly run by the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and ISNS that I'm president of. And the aim of that task force is to reach out into low and middle income countries, the 1/3 to 1/2 of babies in the world that are born without any form of newborn screening, and see whether or not we can do something to introduce appropriate screening packages. Of course, it would mean that there would have to be treatment available, but for some of these conditions, there is simple and effective and cheap treatment available that would be appropriate in those countries. So that's exciting. I guess the other thing that we're trying to do, which is just in a sense a breaking news story, is it was suggested to us that we should lobby to form an international newborn screening day. And so on behalf of ISNS, we want to do that, and we're beginning to approach organizations such as UNESCO and others to get an international newborn screening day in the calendar. And we hope that that will be on June the 28th. We hope to launch this in 2022. And we've chosen June the 28th because it's the birthday of Robert Guthrie, that guy that I described earlier, who first described and introduced testing for phenylketonuria. So that's a really exciting development. We're hoping that other societies such as Metabolic Support UK, but other professional societies, commercial industries, interested politicians will get solidly behind that, and we'll be able to have a series of events each year that both promote and announce newborn screening within our own countries, but as I say, in a wider world. Yes, I think I do really. I mean, people have said, and it is quite true, that screening is not just a test, but a pathway or a program. And that pathway and program involves many elements. So it starts off, of course, with a family. It includes the midwife who takes the sample. It goes on to include the clinicians who treat the babies that are identified as a result. And importantly, these days, it includes those involved in IT, who are the kind of glue and cement that very often link that all together. So I think the IMD community particularly has a key role in that. 6 of the 9 conditions that we screen for in the UK, and the majority of the conditions that are screened for worldwide, are inherited metabolic disorders. So newborn screening is, in a sense, your program. It's about inherited metabolic disease and other disorders, but inherited metabolic disease features strongly. And of course, what we need from that are strong groups with a strong patient voice.